doubt remained in Mr. Samuel Gorby's mind. The gentleman in the light fawn coat had threatened to murder Oliver White, and there was no question that he had carried out his threat. What the detective had now to do was to find who the gentleman in the light fawn coat was. There was only one person who, in Mr. Gorby's opinion, could tell his name, and that was Morland, the intimate friend of the dead man. They appeared, from the landlady's description, to have been so friendly that it was more than likely White would have told Morland all about his angry visitor. Besides, Morland's knowledge of his dead friend's life and habits might be able to supply information on 2 points, namely, who was most likely to gain by White's death, and who the heiress was that the deceased boasted he would marry. But the fact that Morland should be ignorant of his friend's tragic death, notwithstanding that the papers were full of it and gave an excellent description of his personal appearance, greatly puzzled Gorby. The only way in which to account for Morland's extraordinary silence was that he was out of town, and had neither seen the papers nor heard anyone talking about the murder. If this were the case, he might either stay away for an indefinite time, or return after a few days. It was worthwhile going down to St. Kilda in the evening, on the chance that Morland might have returned to town, and would call at White's lodgings to see his friend. So, after his tea, Mr. Gorby put on his hat, and went down to Possum Villa, on what he could not help acknowledging to himself was a very slender possibility. Mrs. Hableton opened the door for Gorby, and in silence led the way not into her own sitting-room, but into a much more luxuriously furnished apartment which Gorby guessed immediately had been White's. He looked keenly round the room, and his estimate of the dead man's character was formed at once. "Fast," he said to himself, "and a spendthrift. A man who would have his friends, and possibly his enemies, among a very shady lot of people." Mr. Gorby put his hands in his capacious pockets and strolled leisurely through the room, examining everything with a curious eye. The walls were covered with pictures of celebrated horses and famous jockeys. Alternating with these were photographs of ladies of the stage, mostly London actresses and burlesque stars, evidently being the objects of the late Mr. White's adoration. "Fond of the ladies, I see," said Mr. Gorby, nodding his head towards the mantelpiece. "A set of hussies," said Mrs. Hableton grimly, closing her lips tightly. "I feel that ashamed when I dusts them as never was. I don't believe in gals getting their pictures taken with hardly any clothes on, as if they just got out of bed, but Mr. White seems to like 'em." "Most young men do," answered Mr. Gorby dryly. "Brutes. I'd drown 'em in a yarra, I would, a-setting themselves and a-calling themselves lords of creation, as if women were made for nothing but to earn money and to see them drink it as my husband did, which his inside never seemed to have enough beer, and me a poor lone woman with no family, thank God, or they'd have taken after their father in his drinking habits." Mr. Gorby took no notice, but stood looking at Mr. White's library, which seemed to consist mostly of French novels and sporting newspapers. "Zola," he said thoughtfully, taking down a flimsy yellow book, rather tattered. "I've heard of him. If his novels are as bad as his reputation, I shouldn't care to read 'em." Here a knock came at the front door, loud and decisive. On hearing it, Mrs. Hableton sprang hastily to her feet. "That may be Mr. Morland," she said, as the detective quickly replaced Zola in the bookcase. "I never have visitors in the evening, being a lone widder, and if it is him, I'll bring him in here." She went out, and presently Gorby, who was listening intently, heard a man's voice ask if Mr. White was at home. "No, sir, he ain't," answered the landlady. "But there's a gentleman in his room asking after him. Won't you come in, sir?" "For a rest, yes," returned the visitor, and immediately afterwards Mrs. Hableton appeared, ushering in the late Oliver White's most intimate friend. He was a tall, slender man, with a pink and white complexion, curly fair hair, and a drooping straw-coloured moustache, altogether a strikingly aristocratic individual. He was well dressed in a suit of check, and had a cool, nonchalant air about him. "And where is Mr. White tonight?" he asked, sinking into a chair, and taking no more notice of Gorby than if he had been an article of furniture. "Haven't you seen him lately?" asked the detective. Mr. Morland stared in an insolent manner at his questioner for a few moments, as if he were debating the advisability of answering or not. At last he apparently decided that he would, for slowly pulling off one glove, he leant back in his chair. "No, I have not. I have been up the country for a few days and arrived back only this evening, so I have not seen him for over a week. Why do you ask?" The detective did not answer, but stood looking at the young man before him in a thoughtful manner. "I didn't know that White had started a lunatic asylum during my absence. Who are you?" "My name is Gorby, sir, and I am a detective." "Ah, indeed. What has White been doing? Running away with someone's wife, eh?" Gorby shook his head. "What then? Nothing can surprise me, I assure you. He was always an erratic individual." "He paid regular?" interrupted Mrs. Hableton, pursing up her lips. "A most enviable reputation to possess, and one I'm afraid I'll never enjoy. But why all this questioning about White? What's the matter with him?" "He's dead." All Morland's nonchalance vanished on hearing this, and he started up from his chair. "Dead? What do you mean?" "I mean that Mr. Oliver White was murdered in a hansom cab." Morland stared at the detective in a puzzled sort of way and passed his hand across his forehead. "Excuse me, my head is in a whirl," he said, as he sat down again. "White murdered? Poor fellow! Poor fellow! Poor fellow!" And much overcome, he buried his face in his hands. Mr. Gorby was touched by this evident distress, and even Mrs. Hableton permitted a small tear to roll down one hard cheek as a tribute of sorrow and sympathy. Presently Morland spoke. "Tell me all about it." The detective related all that he knew concerning White's murder. When it was done, the dead man's friend lifted up his head and looked sadly at the detective. "If I had been in town," he said, "this would not have happened, for I was always beside White." "You knew him very well, sir?" "We were like brothers. I came out from England in the same steamer with him, and used to visit him constantly here." Mrs. Hableton nodded her head to imply that such was the case. "In fact, I believe I was with him on the night he was murdered." Mrs. Hableton gave a slight scream, and threw her apron over her face, but the detective sat unmoved, though Morland's last remark had startled him considerably. "At what time did you meet White on that Thursday night?" "Let me see. It was about 9:30. I was in the Orient Hotel in Burke Street. We had a drink together, and then went up the street to an hotel in Russell Street, where we had another. In fact, we had several other drinks." "Brutes," muttered Mrs. Hableton below her breath. "It's hardly the thing to confess it, but in a case like this I feel it my duty to throw all social scruples aside. We both became very drunk." "And what happened then?" "I fancy White left the hotel some minutes before 1 o'clock on Friday morning." "And what did you do?" "He had left his overcoat behind him, and I picked it up and followed him to return it. I was too drunk to see in which direction he'd gone, so I stood leaning against the hotel door in Burke Street with the coat in my hand. And then someone came up, snatched the coat from me, and made off with it. The last thing I remember was shouting out, 'Stop, thief!' and then I must have fallen down, for next morning I was in bed with all my clothes on, and they were very muddy. I got up and left town for the country by the 6:30 train, so I knew nothing about the matter until I came back to Melbourne tonight. That's all I know." "What was your impression of White that night?" "He was in pretty good spirits, though he was put out at first." "What was the cause of his being put out?" Morland arose, and going to a side table brought White's photograph album, which he laid before the detective and opened in silence. The contents were very much the same as the photographs in the room, with burlesque actresses and ladies of the ballet predominating, but Mr. Morland turned over the pages till nearly the end, when he stopped and pushed the album towards Mr. Gorby. "That was the cause," he said. It was the portrait of a charmingly pretty girl, dressed in white, with a sailor hat on her fair hair, and holding a lawn tennis racket. She was bending half forward with a winning smile, and in the background bloomed a mass of tropical plants. Mrs. Hableton uttered a cry of surprise at seeing this. "Why, it's Miss Frettlby," she said. "How did he know her?" "Knew her father, letter of introduction and all that sort of thing." "Ah, indeed," said Mr. Gorby slowly. "So Mr. White knew Mark Frettlby, the wool millionaire. But how did he obtain a photograph of the daughter?" "She gave it to him," said Morland. "The fact is, White was very much in love with Miss Madge Frettlby." "And she was in love with someone else?" "Exactly. Yes, she loves a Mr. Brian Fitzgerald. They're now engaged. White and he used to quarrel desperately over the young lady. Fitzgerald's from Ireland, I believe." "Indeed. Do you know him?" "Oh, dear, no. White's friends were not mine. He was a rich young man who had good introductions. I'm only a poor devil on the outskirts of society, trying to push my way in the world." "Are you acquainted with Mr. Fitzgerald's personal appearance?" "Oh, yes, I can describe that. In fact, he's not at all unlike me, which I take to be rather a compliment, as he's said to be good-looking. He is tall, rather fair, talks in a bored sort of manner, and is altogether what one would call a heavy swell. This good lady must have seen him. White told me he was here 3 or 4 weeks ago." "Oh, that was Mr. Fitzgerald, was it?" said Mrs. Hableton in surprise. "Yes, he's rather like you. So the lady they quarrelled over must have been Miss Frettlby." "Very likely," said Morland, rising. "Well, I'm off. Here's my address," putting a card in Gorby's hand. "I'm glad to be of any use to you in this matter, as White was my dearest friend. I'll do all in my power to help you to find out the murderer." "I don't think that will be a very difficult matter," said Mr. Gorby. The old Greek legend of Midas turning everything he touched into gold is truer than most people imagine. Indeed, we of the 19th century still believe in this power of transformation, and in fact may observe it in action. We call it luck. And he who possesses luck should be happy. Worldly wealth, domestic contentment, high position, and complete success, all these things belong to the man who has luck. Mark Frettlby was one of these fortunate individuals, and his luck was proverbial throughout Australia. He had come out in the early days of the colony with comparatively little money, but his great perseverance and never-failing luck had soon changed his hundreds into thousands, and now, at the age of 55, he did not himself know the extent of his income. He had large sheep stations scattered all over the colony of Victoria, a charming country house, where at certain seasons of the year he dispensed hospitality to his friends, and a magnificent townhouse down in the wealthy and fashionable Melbourne suburb of St Kilda, which would not have been unworthy of Park Lane. Nor were his domestic relations less happy. He had a charming wife and an equally charming daughter, who, being both pretty and an heiress, naturally attracted crowds of suitors. But Madge Frettlby was capricious and refused innumerable offers. Being an extremely independent young person with a mind of her own, she decided to remain single, as she had not yet seen anyone she could love. And so, with her mother, she continued to dispense the hospitality of the mansion at St Kilda. But the fairy prince comes at length to every woman, and in this instance he came at his appointed time in the person of Mr. Brian Fitzgerald, a tall, handsome, fair-haired young man hailing from Ireland. He had left behind him in the old country a ruined castle and a few acres of barren land inhabited by discontented tenants who refused to pay the rent and talked darkly about the Land League and other agreeable things. Under these circumstances, with no money coming in and no prospect of doing anything in the future, Brian had left the castle of his forefathers to the rats and the family banshee, and had come out to Australia to make his fortune. He brought letters of introduction to Mark Frettlby, and that gentleman, taking a fancy to him, assisted him by every means in his power. Under Frettlby's advice, Brian bought a sheep station, and to his astonishment, in a few years, he found himself growing rich. The Fitzgeralds had always been more famous for spending than for saving, and it was an agreeable surprise to their latest representative to find the money rolling in instead of out. He began to indulge in castles in the air concerning that other castle back in Ireland. In his mind's eye he saw the old place rise up in all its pristine splendour from out its ruins, and he naturally thought of giving it a mistress. Brian Fitzgerald had fallen in love with Madge Frettlby, and having decided in his own mind that she and none other was fitted to grace the visionary halls of his renovated castle, he declared himself. She, womanlike, coquetted with him for some time, but at last confessed in a low voice, with a pretty smile on her face, that she could not live without him. Brian hunted all over the jewellers' shops in Melbourne with lover-like assiduity, and having obtained a ring wherein were set turquoise stones as blue as his own eyes, he placed it on his lover's slender finger, and at last felt that his engagement was an accomplished fact. He had just screwed up his courage for the awful ordeal of speaking to his intended's father, when something occurred which postponed the interview. Mrs. Frettlby was out driving, and the horses took fright and bolted. The coachman and groom both escaped unhurt, but Mrs. Frettlby was thrown out and killed instantly. This was the first really great trouble which had fallen on Mark Frettlby, and he seemed stunned by it. Shutting himself up in his room, he refused to see anyone, even his daughter, and appeared at the funeral with a white and haggard face which shocked everyone. When everything was over and the body of the late Mrs. Frettlby was consigned to the earth with all the pomp and ceremony which money could give, the bereaved husband rode home and resumed his old life. But he was never the same again. His face, which had always been so genial and so bright, became stern and sad. He seldom smiled, and when he did, it was a faint, wintry smile which seemed mechanical. His whole interest in life was centred in his daughter. She became the sole mistress of the St. Kilda mansion, and her father idolized her. She was apparently the one thing left to him which gave him a pleasure in existence. In truth, had it not been for her bright presence, Mark Frettlby would fain have been lying beside his dead wife in the quiet graveyard. After a time, Brian again resolved to ask Mr. Frettlby for the hand of his daughter. But for the second time, fate interposed. A rival suitor made his appearance, and Brian's hot Irish temper rose in anger at him. Mr. Oliver White had come out from England a few months previously, bringing with him a letter of introduction to Mr. Frettlby, who received him hospitably, as was his custom. Taking advantage of this, White lost no time in making himself perfectly at home in the St. Kilda mansion. From the outset, Brian took a dislike to the newcomer, and Madge shared his revulsion. On his part, Mr. White affected not to notice the coldness of Madge's reception of him. On the contrary, he began to pay her the most marked attentions, and at length asked her to be his wife. And, notwithstanding her prompt refusal, he spoke to her father on the subject. Much to the astonishment of his daughter, Mr. Frettlby not only consented to White paying his addresses to Madge, but gave that young lady to understand that he wished her to consider the Englishman's proposals favourably. In spite of all Madge could say, her father refused to alter his decision, and White, feeling himself safe, began to treat Brian with an insolence which was highly galling to Fitzgerald's proud nature. Eventually, as Mr. Gorby had discovered, Fitzgerald had called on White at his lodgings, and after a violent quarrel had left the house, vowing to kill him should he marry Madge Frettlby. That same night, Fitzgerald finally had his interview with Mr. Frettlby. He confessed that he loved Madge, and that his love was returned, so when Madge added her entreaties to Brian's, Mr. Frettlby found himself unable to withstand the combined forces, and gave his consent to their engagement. When, shortly after this happy event, the news reached White that Madge was engaged to his rival, he swore that he would never enter the Frettlby house again. He little knew how prophetic were his words, for it was on that very night he met his death. About 2 weeks after the announcement of the engagement, Mark Frettlby gave a dinner party in honour of his daughter's birthday. It was a delightful evening. The wide French windows which led onto the veranda were open, letting in a gentle breeze from the ocean, and through the screen of tropical plants the guests could just see the waters of the bay glittering in the pale moonlight. Mark Frettlby was at the head of the table, and he appeared in very good spirits. His stern features were somewhat relaxed, and he drank more wine than usual. The soup had just been removed, when someone who was late entered with apologies and took his seat. Someone, in this case, was Mr. Felix Rolston, one of the best-known young men in Melbourne. He had an income of his own, scribbled a little for the papers, was to be seen at every house of any pretensions, and was always bright, happy, and full of news. For details of any scandal you were safe in applying to Felix Rolston. He knew all that was going on, both at home and abroad. And his knowledge, if not very accurate, was at least extensive, while his conversation was piquant and at times witty. "Ah, Rolston," said Mr. Frettlby, who was looking at him with an amused smile. "What news have you?" Rolston felt he held sensation in his hands. There was nothing he liked better. "Well, do you know," he said, gravely fixing in his eyeglass, "they have found out the name of the fellow who was murdered in the Hansom Cab." "Never!" cried everyone eagerly. "Yes," went on Rolston, "and what's more, you all know him." "It's never White," said Brian in a horrified tone. "Hang it, how did you know?" said Rolston, rather annoyed at being forestalled. "Why, I only just heard it myself." "Oh, easily enough," said Brian, rather confused. "I used to meet White constantly, and as I have not seen him for the last 2 weeks, I thought he might be the victim." "How did they find out?" asked Mr. Frettlby, idly toying with his wine-glass. "Oh, one of those detective fellows, you know," answered Felix. "They can find out everything. Awfully exciting, like putting a Chinese puzzle together. Gad, I wouldn't mind being a detective myself." "I'm sorry to hear White's dead," said Frettlby. "He had a letter of introduction to me, and seemed a clever, pushing young fellow." "He was a confounded cad," muttered Felix under his breath, and Brian, who overheard him, seemed inclined to assent. For the rest of the meal, nothing was talked about but the murder and the mystery in which it was shrouded. When the gentlemen later joined the ladies in the drawing-room, one of their number was engaged in playing one of those detestable pieces of the morceau de salon order, in which an unoffending air is taken and variations embroidered on it till it becomes a perfect agony to distinguish the tune amid the perpetual rattle of quavers and demi-semi-quavers. The melody in this case was "Over the Garden Wall," and the young lady was playing the air in the bass with a great deal of power. That is, the loud pedal was down, and with a perpetual rattle of treble notes trying with all their shrill might to drown the tune. "Gad, it's getting over the garden wall in a hailstorm," said Felix. He strolled over to the piano, for he saw that the musician was Dora Featherweight, an heiress to whom he was then paying attention. When the fair Dora had paralyzed her audience with one final bang and rattle, as if the gentleman going over the wall had tumbled into the cucumber frame, Felix was loud in his expressions of delight. "Such power, you know, Miss Featherweight," he said, sinking into a chair and wondering if any of the piano strings had given way at that last crash. "You put all your heart into it, and all your muscle, too, begad," he added mentally. "It's nothing but practice," answered Miss Featherweight, with a modest blush. "I'm at the piano 4 hours every day." Good heavens, thought Felix, what a time the family must have of it. But he kept this remark to himself, and screwing his eyeglass into his left organ of vision, merely ejaculated, "Ah, lucky piano." Madge and Brian were in a corner of the room talking over White's death. "I never liked him," she said, "but it is horrible to think of him dying like that." "I don't know. From all I can hear, dying by chloroform is a very easy death.
Death can never be easy, especially to a young man so full of health and spirits as Mr. White was.
Madge, I believe you're sorry he's dead.
Aren't you?
I detested him when he was alive. You can't expect me to regret his end.
Madge did not answer him, but glanced quickly at his face, and for the first time it struck her that he looked ill. "What is the matter with you, dear?" she asked, placing her hand on his arm. "You're not looking well."
Nothing. I've been a little worried about business lately, that's all. But come, let us go outside, for I see your father has got that girl with the steam whistle voice to sing.
Madge stifled a laugh as she went onto the veranda with Fitzgerald. "What a shame of you," she said. "She's been taught by the best masters."
"How I pity them," retorted Brian grimly. Madge did not answer, but leaning lightly over the high rail of the veranda, looked out into the beautiful moonlit night. There were a number of people passing along the esplanade, some of whom stopped and listened to the singing. One man in particular seemed to have a taste for music, for he persistently stared over the fence at the house. Brian and Madge talked of divers subjects, but every time Madge looked up, she saw the man watching the house.
"What does that man want, Brian?"
"What man?" asked Brian, starting. "Oh, he's taken up with the music, I suppose, that's all."
Madge said nothing, but she could not help thinking there was more in it than the music.
Presently the singing ceased, and she proposed to go in. "Why?" asked Brian, who was lying back in a comfortable seat smoking a cigarette. "It's nice enough here." Madge smiled.
"I must attend to my guests. You stop here and finish your cigarette."
And with a gay laugh she flitted into the house. Brian sat and smoked, staring out into the moonlight the while. Yes, the man was certainly watching the house, for he sat on one of the seats and kept his eyes fixed on the brilliantly lighted windows. Brian threw away his cigarette and shivered slightly. "Could anyone have seen me?" he muttered uneasily.